Hi, folks, and welcome once again to the Lex Rex Institute podcast. We've got a lot of exciting material for you guys today, broadcasting on a Wednesday, which is unusual for us.
Yep, that's true. We had some scheduling conflicts that we wanted to make sure got sorted out. Basically, we're going to be telling you, or Haberbush is going to be telling you something that will be relevant on Wednesday but wouldn't be relevant earlier. I actually don't know what he's going to say, so I'm looking forward to that.
It's a surprise. We do have a major filing that, if you're listening to this on the day that it comes out, occurred yesterday, Tuesday. What's the date? That's March 14th?
6th?
March 6th, I'm sorry. No,
7th.
7th.
Yeah.
March 7th.
We'll get there
that's
eventually,
right.
yeah.
But before we get to that, let's go ahead and listen to our intro.
Look at these 3 words written larger than the rest, with a special pride never written before or since. Tall words proudly saying, "We the people."
So we the people meeting on a Wednesday this time. So I guess couple big announcements. Big one that just came out is we filed a brief in a case challenging San Francisco's law that allows non-citizens to vote in school board elections. So we filed an amicus brief in that case. That was filed yesterday as you're listening to this. And we will post a link to that in our description. You can read that. That was filed along with Public Interest Legal Foundation. That is Christian Adams' law firm. He's a big name in election law, but sort of an exciting case that we're working on. And other news.
Anything else you want to say about that, or is that it?
Well, it's so our challenge was sort of along limited lines because it's an amicus brief, so it's sort of peripheral to the overall case. But
why don't we take a second, because I'm not sure how many people are actually going to know what that means, but just in shortest possible time, what's an amicus brief?
Yeah, so amicus is friends of the court. That's what amicus means, is friend, I think.
Yeah.
My Latin's not great.
I think that's correct, yeah.
But basically it means it's a brief filed by someone who is not a party in that lawsuit, so not the plaintiff or defendant, in support of either the plaintiff or defendant. So usually they'll address a more limited line of attack or something that didn't get addressed in one of the briefs on the merits, and I can't go into all our strategy for filing this, but basically our focus was narrow, and it was on what's called voter disenfranchisement or vote dilution. And our argument is that by drawing district lines, and in particular by allowing votes from persons who are not citizens of the United States, the votes of citizens of the United States are diluted. They're worth less because other people who really shouldn't have a stake are permitted to vote. But if you want to read more about that, you can click on the link in our description. And the other news is, here, actually David doesn't know this one either. I just picked up this engagement ring today. It's not in focus. There. So hopefully by the time this comes out, I'll have an answer, and hopefully the answer is not no. But I guess we'll know for certain by then.
It'll be really awkward if it is, I'll tell you that.
Well, you can cut this part if it is. But no,
you'll have to tell me if that happens.
So I will be asking Kristen to marry me this Saturday. We're going where we went for our first date. So that's exciting news in my life.
Yeah.
And as she's an employee of the Institute, it's exciting news for the Institute as well. So.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, okay. I didn't know either of those things.
Here, let me bring it into better focus. That was terrible. Okay, let's turn this DLA. There you go. You can see why I'm not the videographer. But anyway, so if you're listening to this, there's a reason to check it out on YouTube, so you can see what we're talking about.
Yeah,
that's a green sapphire.
I was gonna say it didn't look terribly diamondy, but there you go.
No, I don't buy into the whole De Beers propaganda.
Anyway, we do have an actual show to get to, so we should probably get into the program.
Plus, Kristen likes color, so that's the actual reason. It's not just sort of spite toward the De Beers company.
Yeah. So just a forecast of what's ahead. We are going to be continuing our series on the Russian Revolution, which we're calling Red February. It is no longer February, but in this episode, we're actually going to be talking about the February Revolution. So that was really the reason we called it that to begin with.
And then our next episode is going to be October, right? We're going to wait several months and then release the next one.
Not quite. I think we're also going to touch on the October Revolution as well. But The episode after this, we will finish up with the Russian Revolution by talking about the Soviet constitutions. So you can look forward to that next time. But before we
were supposed to cover a bit of legal news first, right?
Yes. Before we get to that, on the 28th of February, which was last week when we're recording this, or rather last week from when you hear this, the Supreme Court heard oral argument in a pair of cases pertaining to the Biden administration's student debt relief program. One, Biden v. Nebraska, and the other, Department of Education v. Brown. Crucially, not Brown v. Board of Education. That's a different case. But when I was trying to find information about this one, Google thought I was talking about that one.
Yeah, I don't think Google pays attention to word order. I think
or apparently the difference between a board and a department. So I had to add Department of Education v. Brown 2023 to get to what I was looking for.
But this is an issue we've talked about before, right? President Biden's student loan forgiveness program, which for those of you who are not familiar, I think most people probably are. But basically, if it were to be upheld by unilateral fiat, President Joe Biden has decided he's going to erase from the books, I think it's $10,000 each for individuals filing and $20,000 for people who are filing jointly, something like that.
It's for people with student loan debts making, I think it's under $125,000 a year, which that's probably the vast majority of people who hold student loan debts. If you're filing singly, and I think just directly double that if you file as a married couple, cancellation up to $10,000 of each individual's debt who qualifies that way. And I think Pell Grant recipients is the qualification to get the $20,000 cancellation, which is the sort of the upper limit. But
obviously a grossly unfair program. We've complained about it before. I mean, it's a tax, right? It's everybody who didn't get student loans is paying for the people who did. They can try to couch it as debt forgiveness, but really it is an expenditure of money because debt is money. Debt's just negative money.
Right. Yeah. This is money that's coming out of the budget. It will be made up some other way. They're not just going to decide to slash the budget as much as we might want them to.
And those of us who did not get student loans are the ones who have to pay for it, which I see that as sort of grossly regressive in character because at least theoretically, if you've been to college, you now have a higher earning potential, right? So we're taking people that have that higher earning potential and subsidizing them at the expense of people who maybe made more responsible decisions, didn't get that, or maybe by circumstance were forced to make decisions where they didn't get that. But either way, people who are less able to earn higher wages are subsidizing those who are more able to do so. Obviously kind of grossly regressive. I think for those of us who, personally, I went to law school and I wasn't going to go to law school unless I could find a place that would pay for my tuition. I was very blessed and did well on the LSAT and found a place that would do that. But there were schools that were more highly ranked that I was accepted to that I did not attend because I was planning my life around the expectation of having to pay student loans. I'm sure very many people are in that situation. So being forced to subsidize somebody else's student loans, I think if that were upheld, would be sort of an egregious miscarriage of justice. So but the cases themselves, they're not focusing on that particular issue. Now, I know that for a while, I think Claremont, I know we were considering bringing a challenge on the basis of the spending clause, which is basically, House of Representatives has the authority to spend money. President doesn't have that. If he wants to spend money, he has to go to Congress and make sure that they authorize him to do it. He didn't do that. That's the challenge that I would have liked to see. This challenge is not on those grounds. So what grounds are these two challenges on?
Yeah, so essentially both of the challenges, and we'll get into the differences between the two cases, but the sort of the positive argument that they're making against the government's plan is that the statute the government is relying on, which is the HEROES Act, we talked about that before as well, that's basically authorizing the executive branch to make modifications to programs in the event of a national emergency.
Oh, and drop a link to the video where we talk about that too. Has it been on the podcast or just on the Remedial Civics series?
We definitely talked about aspects of this before on the podcast. I think before we were doing this as video, but we'll figure out where we've talked about those before.
I know that we talked about that with John Ahrens too when he was doing the Remedial Civics series. So Put a link to both of those so people aren't left searching for them.
Yeah. But basically, because what the government is leaning on is this act has these emergency circumstances powers. COVID counts as that. So we're just going to lean on that. And basically, it's challenges to the interpretation of the statute that the government is leaning on.
Right. Yep. So that brings into effect our old friend, my old friend, we meet again. And who's that old friend? Well, the Chevron doctrine.
Yeah. And
What's the Chevron doctrine, David?
We have absolutely talked about this on the podcast before. So
if you've listened to this podcast at all, except for maybe our very last episode, you know about the Chevron doctrine. But basically it means that courts must defer to the interpretation of administrative agencies of acts of Congress unless those interpretations are unreasonable.
Yeah.
So
that's really the main question.
So what's the actual text of the statute of the HERO Act that's at issue here?
So in these cases in particular, the big focus is on a couple of verbs from that law: waive and modify. Right. So the government is authorized to waive or modify sort of individual aspects of an existing program in the event of emergency. The question is whether this qualifies or if this goes beyond that.
The power to modify, as I understand, in the statute is a little bit broader than the power to waive, right? Because they can modify a whole program. Because, modification means you're just changing certain aspects of that program. Whereas waiver, they can't get rid of an entire program through waiver. They can only waive certain provisions of that program. So the issue of whether or not this constitutes a waiver of those student loans that have been incurred or just merely a modification of those loans is going to be pivotal to this case.
Yeah, and another aspect of this was that the statute limits what can be done in order to prevent basically harm to individuals. The idea being if there's an emergency that would cause financial distress, because we talked about this before, but the HEROES Act was basically implemented for people who were going to go to war
after 9/11.
With debt from coming back home, having done their service and being worse off financially. So the idea was we want to prevent harm from them, harm from being done to them because of an event of national emergency.
Right.
So
here we're saying that COVID-19 is an emergency, which may have made people who graduated earn less.
Yeah.
I think Lex Rex took plenty of opportunities during COVID-19, so I'm not sure that actually would have hamstrung anybody, but not everybody's in our situation. I'll grant them that. So, COVID-19 made them earn less. They're arguing that is the sort of emergency that would bring into effect these powers.
Yeah, and a part of it, too, was, there are certain people for whom this amount of loan forgiveness will just wipe out their debt, so they won't have any payments anymore. And so the question, in part is, are those people actually just having, is this harm prevention for them, or is this actually just giving them a benefit, basically, they wouldn't otherwise have had?
Right.
And again,
it's not deferring payment.
Right.
It's not lowering the interest rate. It's not, you can, rather than having a 10-year term, you can have a 15-year term on this, and your payment can be a little bit less. That would be a modification of the terms of their repayment. But here it's just, it's $10,000 lower now.
Yeah. And I feel like out of context, we're going to sound very sort of bitter and spiteful when we're talking about, how dare we, make things easier for people. The thing to bear in mind, again, which you did mention at the beginning of this, I just want to reiterate, other people have to bear the expense for this.
Well, and here's the thing is, here's the point I want to make every time we address this issue. Our bankruptcy laws are so draconian and unfair when it comes to student loan debts. There's basically no way to get out from under this stuff. Everything else, we've got an escape valve for any other kind of debt that you incur. Obviously, you don't want to file bankruptcy. There are built-in consequences for doing that. Your credit will be hurt for a long time. You can only do it, it's not something you can do again and again repeatedly in a short period of time. There are consequences to it. They're built into the system. Well, all of these student loan debts were specifically given carve-outs in the 2006 modifications to the bankruptcy law, such that they are not dischargeable in bankruptcy. If we really want to give these people Because I understand a lot of people incurred tons of debt for school. A lot of people want to get out from under that. If we really want to enable them to do that, relaxing the bankruptcy law was the way to do it. Not just an outright, poof, somebody else is paying for your loan now.
Yeah, and, especially because this program doesn't do anything for future generations. This isn't going to apply to anybody, the number of people who have substantial student loan debt probably is a serious issue facing the economy.
Sure.
But just doing this as a one-off thing isn't going to help anybody who didn't go to college at a very specific time. And if we don't change the way that system works in broader strokes, including, as you mentioned very pertinently, the bankruptcy system, it doesn't do anything for the future. This is a very short-sighted
We've got a legal, constitutionally recognized, bankruptcy laws are mentioned in the Constitution. The Congress is supposed to set uniform laws of bankruptcy. We have a way of dealing with out-of-control debts. That already exists. Let's not make it impossible to deal with student loans. That's the reason why there's a crisis on this issue, and it's very easy to fix.
Yep. But anyway, so to get particularly into these cases, let's start with Biden v. Nebraska, which I believe was the first.
That's a state challenging the law, right?
Yeah, a group of states, but it's sort of
So remember, to bring a lawsuit, you have to allege harm. The person who's bringing the lawsuit actually has to be the person harmed. That's a central component of the idea of standing, which we've talked about a lot before. So what's the harm to Nebraska here?
Yeah. So interestingly, despite the fact that Nebraska is the only state named in sort of the short form of the case, it's actually really more about Missouri, because Missouri created this corporate entity to service student loans. They call it MOHELA. It's an acronym, like Higher Education Loan Authority of the state of Missouri.
Yeah. Some financial institution to manage student loans. Sure.
Yeah.
Go on.
And it's operated as a corporation, but it's sort of, one of those quasi-public sort of things like Amtrak or something.
Like we all love. Yeah. Our favorite ones are all those.
So,
that's the characterizing feature of fascism,
Corporatism, yeah.
That's when you have corporations that are kind of quasi-public like that. That is the central feature of fascism. I mean, they can talk about militarism and all the rest of it. Those are kind of the trappings. What actually makes fascism is that corporatist system. So, FYI.
Yeah, fun fact.
Fun fact. That's fascist.
So this entity, MOHELA, services a bunch of student loan debts. Excesses that they bring in, like beyond what their operating budget is, gets paid back to Missouri into a fund that offers financial aid to students. So Missouri is
that was very complicated, David. A little simpler.
So, all right, fair enough. I'll try. I'll see if I can.
Some of our eyes start glazing over as soon as you start talking about.
Okay, so Missouri created an entity to handle student loans. Any profits that entity makes go into a fund that the state maintains to provide financial aid to other students.
So if students are paying less on their student loans, this corporation makes less of a profit. That affects the state's coffers. Ergo, the state is harmed.
Right. That's the argument. And, it gets slightly more complicated in that if MOHELA, that entity, suffers losses, the state isn't liable. That was part of the whole argument, hashing out, should we treat
that's
this
kind of
entity...
silly.
Well...
I think a better argument is that it depends on the voluntary action of the state that it's harmed here. They didn't have to create this entity.
Yeah. And a key factor
even if they make less profit, that's still harm.
Yeah.
It's not merely the fact that the state's not liable. That's silly. That's a dumb argument.
Yeah. Well, another one of the arguments was that MOHELA itself declined to sue. And
irrelevant.
One of the reasons it gave was that it didn't anticipate actually generating any real profit, and it gave a report to that effect.
Okay,
I don't know
so they're saying okay, well that is a test. If the profits are unduly speculative, then you can't allege harm. So
right, and I haven't read their financials. I don't know if if that forecast was accurate or not. MOHELA is saying we weren't.
It seems like it'd be hard not to turn a profit on unforgivable student loans.
You'd think, but maybe
if you're not making a profit on that, you must work for the government.
Maybe they have just absurd delinquency rates and no collection mechanism. I don't know. Who knows? But
maybe there's a little bit of overhead. Maybe they hired a bunch of bureaucrats on bureaucrat salaries.
Possibly.
What is that?
Fire alarm.
Well, we're back after that rude interruption. As you can probably see from how we're dressed, it's not the same day. David, how long did that go on?
It was about an hour and a half or so before I was able to get back into the building, and that put it pretty close to midnight here in Scotland.
Wow. That's a regular occurrence there?
I think there's been about 10 fire alarms since September when I moved into this building.
Wow.
Yeah.
I don't know that I've ever heard a fire alarm that sounded so effete.
You made you made that comment to me. I don't really know what to tell you. I will observe for anyone who's noticed. I am wearing the same sweatshirt, but it is a different T-shirt underneath. So I have changed my clothes just to be clear.
I haven't washed the shirt I was wearing last time, so
anyway.
I may look a little bit different, but that's fine. So I think we were in the middle of discussing Biden v. Nebraska.
That's right.
When we left off. I don't know. What were we saying about that?
So we talked a bit about the issue of standing being seemingly what the government is trying to emphasize, trying to disqualify this suit basically on the grounds that the states lack standing. And then we had just started, I think, to get into the sort of the substantive argument that the states are making, which is that the statute in question, the HEROES Act, doesn't actually authorize the government to do what they want to do with this debt relief program. And I think we had mentioned, and if we hadn't, I'll just say it now, it really hinges on whether or not this plan to just sort of forgive a certain amount of debt qualifies as a waiver or modification under the terms of the HEROES Act.
I think we did mention that, yeah.
Yeah, so let me, I pulled up the text of the HEROES Act, which it refers back to a prior higher education act that basically created the whole scheme of federal loans to begin with. So when it says Title IV, that's what it's talking about. But what it says about waivers and modifications is this: notwithstanding any other provision of law, unless enacted with specific reference to this section, the Secretary of Education may waive or modify any statutory or regular provision applicable to the student financial assistance programs under Title IV of the Act. And that's that prior act of 1965.
Sure.
So to me, the key point there is it's waiving or modifying provisions of a program. Uh-huh. And that seems to be what the states are taking up here as well, saying you can't just say that writing off a certain amount of the debt is modifying or waiving a provision. You're just sort of
getting rid of it entirely. Yeah, that's certainly a broad reading of waiver or modification.
Yeah, so there are basically...
I think sort of the government's argument here, the federal government's argument was, well, it's a waiver and a modification, right?
Yeah.
which is ironic because it says waive or modify, doesn't it?
Yeah. And
it doesn't say waive and modify. Maybe there's a section in the definition saying that all ors and all ands are to be read as and ors, but I kind of doubt it. So.
Yeah, I don't think that's in here. This one, unlike the 1965 Act, is actually a fairly short law as far as federal law goes. I don't believe that's in there.
Yeah, if it's got to be both of those things, good chance it's neither of those things, and you're exceeding your authority.
Which has led the states to say this isn't waiving or modifying. This is just flat out a new program that you're sort of parading around under the guise of being a waiver or modification.
Sure. So I think we got some audio, some clips from the Supreme Court justices talking about this. Do you want to play that right now?
We do.
Well, could you explain then, in other provisions, there is express language as to cancellation, and of course there isn't here. So would you take a minute to explain how a waiver or modification amounts to a cancellation?
Just to be clear, he's talking about cancellation here because there is a separate provision of the HEROES Act for canceling a program, which, one would think just getting rid of the debt amounts to. It's effectively a cancellation of something, right? I mean, people refer to this as the debt cancellation case, so at least colloquially that's the case. But anyway, he's asking about why it's not that instead of why it isn't that rather than waiver or modification as the government's claiming. So go ahead and play the clip, David.
Of course. So the Secretary identified various provisions in Title IV that govern the terms and conditions of student loans and also govern discharge and cancellation in other circumstances, as your question suggested. And I think the straightforward way to think about how the verbs map on to the Secretary's action is that he waived elements of those provisions that contain eligibility requirements for discharge and cancellation that are inapplicable under this program, and then modified the provisions to contain the limitations that he had announced as part and parcel of announcing this loan forgiveness. Now, you had suggested that there's no express statement in the HEROES Act to discharge loan principal, and that's true, but the relevant and operative language here is the provision that says the Secretary is empowered to waive or modify any Title IV provision. And so the HEROES Act isn't enumerating any of the various forms of relief that have long been authorized and implemented under this statute. I don't think anything can be read into the fact that there's no express reference to particular forms of relief because Congress was trying to broadly cover the field and ensure that the Secretary had the tools to respond to the national emergency with whatever relief might be necessitated.
And we're about to hear Justice John Roberts in a second. But
you don't get any kind of answer to that question till the last sentence there, which is basically, we think the congressional grant of power was broad, right?
Yeah.
By just saying waive or modify, they're saying they're using very broad language there. It refers to basically any change we could possibly want to make.
Yeah.
In a nutshell. In a nutshell was what that answer was.
Yeah, and that's sort of what Justice Roberts is going to ask about in a second.
I find it kind of hilarious, she says, the way that the verbs map onto the language of the statute. I mean, it's very clear that they decided to do one thing and then post hoc tried to, using her words, map that onto the text of the statute. They didn't look at the statute and say, are we authorized to do this thing? They did the thing and then tried to justify it using the statute.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear overall, I think, based on, and we talked about this last time we talked about the HEROES Act. The HEROES Act was basically meant to help military personnel. It's pretty clear that they just wanted to do this, and then they were like, this is as good a basis as...
Well, I just find it, I don't know if hilarious is the right word, maybe disgusting, but I find it absurd that she would basically acknowledge that in her answer.
Yeah. Well, anyway, let's hear a little more, though.
But in an opinion we had a few years ago by Justice Scalia, he talked about what the word modify means. And he said modified, in our view, connotes moderate change. He said it might be good English to say that the French Revolution modified the status of the French nobility, but only because there's a figure of speech called understatement and a literary device known as sarcasm. We're talking about $500 billion and 43 million Americans.
That was a good one.
How does that fit under the normal understanding of modifying?
So, of course, I recognize that in MCI, Justice Scalia's opinion adopted a narrower understanding of that term, but I don't read that opinion to set forth a universal meaning of modify, no matter the statutory context. And here, of course, we have a broader phrase, waive or modify.
Waive or
it's undisputed,
modify.
and the states aren't contesting that the ordinary meaning of waive means to eliminate an obligation in its entirety. And I think if you look at that phrase in the context of the statute, that means that modify has to mean making a change up to the point of wholesale elimination. It would be.
I feel like the word she might be having trouble with here is or.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
It's the fact that waive encompasses more activity than modify does not mean that modify applies more broadly than its colloquial usage.
Yeah. If it had said,
I think that or might be the one she's having trouble with. I mean, lawyers can have this issue sometime. We know that former President Clinton had trouble with the word is. I guess or is another one that lawyers can have trouble with.
He at least had questions about the word is, whether or not they...
I had a law professor my first semester in law school, and he loved to say, because they like to teach Socratically. They ask questions, they kind of interrogate the students, and his favorite phrase was, guys, you don't leave your brains at the door to this classroom.
Yeah.
Like, or means what it colloquially means in a legal context. I find this whole interchange absurd.
The way she's reading it, it would be something more, modify, even waive provisions.
Right, yeah,
that would sort of support the reading she's giving to it.
Right.
But, or, that's trickier. Anyway, just a little bit more, I think, until we get to the end of Justice Roberts' comments. But
really strange for Congress to say you can eliminate obligations altogether or tweak them just the littlest bit, but you can't do anything in between.
Well, but it's waived particular regulatory or statutory provisions.
That's right.
That, to me, suggests a much more focused use of the word.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of the heart of the issue is, what provisions are you waiving? It seems like you're really just sort of pulling at straws to say that you're doing that at all, as opposed to just saying everyone gets 10 grand, basically.
Yeah, we're waiving the provision that requires liability for the debt in the first place, right? So we have a program that creates the student loan for which there is a debt obligation, and now we're waiving that. If you did that, you should waive the fact that you gave them the loan in the first place, right? Because that'd be waiving the actual provision. You're not waiving anything. You're just handing them $10,000. That's not a waiver. Just to say, there's also some issues here about whether the actual entity involved, we mentioned earlier Mohila, the quasi-private state entity from Missouri. Was it Missouri?
Yeah, it's Missouri. Missouri.
But there is an issue here whether or not they're a state actor.
Yeah.
We'll probably get into state actor doctrine one of these days, but for today we got to move on. So
and
just know that there are other issues in this case. So
yeah, and when this case is decided, which probably won't be for a few months, we may have occasion to come back to that issue. But anyway, we're gonna move on now to part 2 of our series on the Russian Revolution, Red February, even though it's now March.
That's right. Part 2 of Red February. So it's technically March. No technically about it. We're going to be a few days into March by the time this airs. But Red February.
We are talking about the February Revolution this time. Some other stuff as well. But we're going to start with the February Revolution. And we're going to talk, this time around, it's still sort of more table setting. We're going to talk about why efforts at something other than communism fell apart in Russia before we go into what the communists really did when they got the control of the country.
Sure.
But so last time around, we talked about some of the things that were making the Tsar look a little wobbly on his throne. And without going too much into historical detail, all of that gets a whole lot worse with World War I for a variety of reasons. Mostly how bad the Russian military turned out to be at fighting World War I.
I mean, like we saw last week, when the Tsar turned out to be really bad at prosecuting the war with Japan, that he'd bragged would be, super easy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's not so great for him. Turns out World War I, a much bigger conflict,
Ooh, boy.
and occurring closer to the more populous parts of Russia, is only going to exacerbate the problem.
Yeah, and the reasons Russia gave for going into the war were very much ones of sort of national honor. You can do your own reading if you're interested in the history, but basically, they staked a lot of prestige on their performance in the war, and did just
we talked
terribly.
last time. Russia's got a little bit of an inferiority complex at this point.
Yeah,
they are well behind the rest of Europe. Everybody else got rid of feudalism about 1,000 years earlier. They're still hanging on to it.
Something like that, yeah.
So, maybe not quite that long, but it's been a while.
Yeah.
Certainly not within living memory for anybody else in Europe.
Yeah, and so, you have mass conscription going on. That's rarely, if ever, popular. Certainly wasn't popular in this case. You also have a very high casualty rate and very bad logistics, and
which tends to happen when the rest of the world has tanks and motorized vehicles, while you are using horses. They have guns, and you have bayonets. They have ammunition, and you have hope.
Yeah, when most armies generally send each man out with a gun, and you're sending about 3 men per gun.
It's the people's gun in the or in the Russians' case. So
yeah, and you also
one gun per every, I think, like 5 soldiers.
It's something absurd. They were massively under-equipped. And this is something I was reading about that I think probably didn't help. We talked about their, lateness in eliminating feudalism. That lingered even longer in the army. So superior officers were supposed to be addressed by titles like Your Excellency instead of just like Sir or their military rank.
Well, sir means they're a knight, doesn't it? So if you call them sir, that's still kind of feudal in a way, isn't it?
It's I think that actually depends on the specific language, but at any rate,
like Sir Elton John. I mean, if you're addressing him,
and enlisted men, common soldiers, could be forced to do like menial chores for their officers. Like go fetching their stuff, not just military duties, like personal sort of servant type stuff. All of which was very unpopular.
Well, popular for the officers, but there's fewer of them.
Probably. But the officers also had a very, very high casualty rate. Lots of them died. Lots of them had to be replaced basically by, somewhat educated peasants. And that sort of, that group were very susceptible to anti-war propaganda. They were always suspicious of their officers. We mentioned last time Germans in the nobility were viewed with suspicion. Turns out a lot of them are in the military. And the Empress was from a German family. And when you're fighting the Germans, that doesn't go down great with the men.
It certainly makes your messaging more difficult, doesn't it? I mean, if you want to rile the people up against the enemy, it's sort of directly at odds with fealty to their commanding officers. So you're going to be a little bit limp-wristed with at least one of the two.
Yeah, and so widespread suspicion starts to build up that not only, not just that the war is going badly, but the war is going badly on purpose, because there's a conspiracy among all of these Germans in the court and in the military to lose the war intentionally so that Germany gains at the expense of Russia.
So it seems they erred on the side of anti-German propaganda.
Yes, and that eventually starts to include the entire royal family. So they're all under suspicion of being secretly pro-German. The Tsar's popularity basically plummets in the military. Right. And
much in the manner of accusing a U.S. president of being in the pocket of Russia.
There's a parallel there.
Is sort of a classic tactic of fomenting revolution and pushing your country to communism.
No comment on that one. But anyway, all of this comes to a head, though, in February, again, Red February of 1917, when basically bad weather brings the whole transportation system to a halt back in Russia.
Nobody could have predicted that in Russia.
Yeah, we talked before about how fragile their rail system was, how new and underdeveloped it had been. It's not adequate when basically any part of it shuts down. And in this case, it meant that basically food wasn't getting to St. Petersburg, the capital.
Yeah, they had like one line in a lot of places.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
if it got shut down, there was no way in.
Right. And they had food, they just couldn't get it where it had to be. And so, agitation starts, demonstrations start, and then the government announces, hey, we're going to have to ration. And that's where things get bad. And we get a second
So because
Sunday.
of sort of a foreign policy crisis that had been entered into by a group of elites that the average person didn't really care about, ends up creating artificial scarcity at home, probably creates widespread inflation.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Not things that we would be familiar with at all.
Sure.
Right. We only get involved in conflicts when America has some interest in them, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Splendid isolation continues to be strong. Right. I'll leave the modern day parallels to your imagination, but eventually
we actually did skip over that. Russia did not have much of an interest in the First World War.
No, outside
in fact,
of
very few countries' alliances.
Yeah, and general commitment to Slavophilia, basically. Something's happening to other Slavic people. We're the most powerful Slavs. We want to be involved. That's nationalism,
which feeds into the anti-German sentiment, by the way, because it's sort of ethno-nationalism that brought about that commitment. So,
definitely. Anyway, the street demonstrations once again turned bloody when the military once again fires on demonstrators. You'd think they'd have learned not to do that at this point, but they hadn't.
That's not funny. I shouldn't laugh at that. That's
well, but it triggers a military mutiny in the capital. And to make a very long story short, the Tsar is eventually pressured by all the high military officials to abdicate, which he does.
Yeah.
Basically, he seems to be unwilling to accept the idea of becoming a limited monarch. We talked before about how important autocracy was to the Tsars. So rather than compromise what he sees as the purity of his office, he just abdicates. And then
this is the point where you would usually get a military junta, right? This is the point where a military coup result. That's what happened in Chile. That's what happened. It happens in South America all the time, it seems like. but this is the point where usually the military comes in, takes over. You usually get a military dictator. What happens in Russia?
Basically, the sort of quasi-parliament takes over, temporarily, at least.
Which is kind of weird. Why does that happen?
Honestly, I think a big part of it was that most of the military didn't really know what to do. Because you had massive...
They had no interest in... Nobody wants to govern Russia, is what it comes down to.
And I think part of it is that most of the officers are probably still at least moderately monarchist in their outlook. They don't really want to get rid of the Tsar, but they know that their men are just done with everything, basically. Their men just want to go home.
I think that's the pivotal part here, is the degree to which officers had sort of lost control of their men. Because typically if you have a military junta, military coup of a government, it's led by those who are in military leadership, right? It's not led by the average soldier. That's not the case here. Because of this rampant anti-German sentiment that's already spreading, this coup is essentially a capitulation of the military officers to their men.
Yeah. And that's going to be very important because Bolshevism basically comes from the army more than anything. It comes from people agitating, sort of radicalizing common soldiers toward this vague, they're not specific about what they're really talking about, because even at this point,
you can't be. I mean, that's part of the whole thing with Marxism, is it's got sort of an eschatological bent of here's where we're going in the future. It's going to be a glorious classless utopia, but we can't tell you too much about it, or you'll probably see that it's kind of stupid.
Yeah, even at this point, the average Russian is not really particularly interested in communism, but they are interested in ending the war. That's probably point number one. And point number two, they're tired of taking orders. So there's a big drive for we want sort of local councils to have authority. That's literally what Soviet means, is council. And so...
And, interestingly, obviously, communism, at least pre-Stalin, is an internationalist movement.
Yeah.
Actually kind of cuts against the zeitgeist right now of the period that we're talking about.
Yeah, definitely. Your average person on the street in Europe isn't very much of an internationalist mindset. They're very much thinking about their nation. That's sort of the popular mood.
Well, and then that is the movement. That's the anti-Tsarist movement in Russia too. It's not an internationalist movement. It's very much pretty early a nativist one.
Yeah, and pretty early on, you get we talked about ethnic minorities in the Russian Empire. They sort of seize this moment. Poland, Finland, a few other areas where the majority of people are not Russians but have been in Russia. Basically say, all right, here's our chance. We want to out of this. and the Duma, that sort of parliamentary body, basically can't exert any real authority, and so
because they never had any because of officially enshrined autocracy. I mean, that is so. Often, and we talked about this in our French Revolution series. Oftentimes, the safe bet, if you're trying to transition a society from one thing to another, is look at the English Revolution. I'm sorry, the English Civil War.
Civil War, yeah.
Yeah, you pick one of the pre-existing, already in place government bodies over and against another. In that case, it was Parliament versus the King, right? And Parliament wins. You're able. There's lots of problems, but you're able to have a somewhat stable government. They remain a prosperous society in the next couple centuries because the entity that continues governing is one that already existed. So, in a sense, they're getting part of it right here in Russia because they're picking a pre-existing governmental entity. Problem is, because their structure of government legally enshrined the czar as autocrat, Duma wasn't really ever a government. It just looked like one.
And one thing that they did that I think is a massive, massive misstep, and I think it sort of lays the whole groundwork for the tragedy that follows, is they basically say, we're not going to deal with figuring out how this whole government thing works on a constitutional level until after the war. And so they keep delaying calling basically a constitutional convention.
Which America, not to the same extent, but America actually made the same mistake early on. We stuck with the Articles of Confederation all through the war, even though we knew there were fundamental defects with it. To our credit, we did have the Articles of Confederation.
Yeah, there was
Russia didn't even have that much.
No, it was just sort of, a group of people who had been elected, but they'd been elected to positions that basically didn't have power. But they just sort of
like
said,
an advisory board.
Yeah, well, we're running the show now, and no one's entirely clear on what that means. So you've got the Duma occupying part of sort of the seat of government, and what's interesting is you have this group of mutineers occupying the other wing of the palace, basically, and they're just kind of, this uneasy situation there. And that's where we get Lenin arriving on the scene. So Vladimir.
Yeah. So just to be clear, what is this group of mutineers? What is that? This is.
Well, it's
not like they have two. It's not like a bicameral legislature. It's not like a Senate and a House. They have a Duma, and they basically have their competitor. If the Duma is Coke, the other one's Pepsi, right?
Yeah, it's literally like rebelling soldiers and sailors and a bunch of communist agitators who joined them. Completely
opportunists that.
Yeah, they just set up shop. But onto that scene,
which is a classic hallmark of not having a government when you have two competing ones. Yeah, I mean it's happened in America. It happened in Rhode Island. They asked the Supreme Court to come and resolve it for them. It's happened. In the 1876 election, I think it happened in a couple of the southern states. It's happened before. It's not unheard of, but it's never an ideal situation, to be sure.
So Lenin had been living in Switzerland. Basically, I think we mentioned most of the communists had left Russia before World War I. So he was in Switzerland. The Germans put him on a train and send him back to Russia, hoping that he'll bother everyone enough and cause disruption and cause the collapse of the Russian war effort.
Right. Just as sort of an espionage kind of thing, right?
Yeah, and that
they want to take down our enemy to make it easier to win.
Yeah, long term, they probably
big swing and a miss there.
That. Yeah,
big swing and a miss on that one. That was a gross miscalculation. But that ended up creating them a lot more problems in the long run than it solved.
Yeah, and Lenin shows up and he starts promulgating. He's got these April theses, he calls them, and he talks about them in speeches, and he has them published in Pravda, which is the Bolshevik newspaper.
Truth media, right?
Yeah.
Truth media. That's what Pravda means, is truth, and it was newspaper, so that's Truth media.
Yeah,
I'm not making a comment there.
And what you'll see is basically that this is really the period where he wins full leadership of the Russian communists. There had always been some kind of division, but this is sort of his shining moment. He shows up
Yeah.
on the scene. He's the only one with a real sort of program, and people fall in line.
Communists have always been, and this is something where even institutes like Lex Rex could learn from the filthy, degenerate commies. But they've always been real good at messaging. They can make a real succinct, simple message, and they can spread it like wildfire. And that's kind of what his theses are. We're going to take sort of a deep dive into those now. Is that right, David?
Yeah. Or as deep as we can get while, keeping this to a reasonable length. But
okay, let me pull them up. I want, for people who are watching this on video, I want them to be able to read it. So here we go. Organized is spelled wrong.
It's the British spelling, and these aren't the full ones. To be fair, these are basically my summation of the 10 theses.
Sure.
But you can follow along with it.
The first one is the war effort should be abandoned unless all power is transferred to the proletariat. The most widespread campaign for this view must be organized in the army at the front.
Yeah. So this is what we were talking about. Where
people are broadly dissatisfied.
Yeah.
They don't like that a bunch of elites are telling them what to do. You got to transfer power for the prosecution of the war to the proletariat. Who's the proletariat? Have we explained that yet? I don't think we have.
Basically, urban laborers.
Yeah.
And we'll see that.
Who better to prosecute a war than
Well,
people who make things in factories.
And that's we're already sort of seeing hints that this is going to be all about sort of exploiting the chaos in order to gain advantage for the communists, rather than to actually sort of maintain Russia's interests in any clear way. But yeah, so basically, we have to demand either an immediate end to the war, which would basically just mean surrendering, because there's no way that the Germans are going to leave at this point, or
right.
full communist control. Basically, that's the alternative that's being proposed here.
And the second thesis is basically the same, but a little bit more theoretical, saying that we're in the middle of a revolution right now. The first stage of that revolution is passing, right? So that first stage in which the bourgeoisie controls, and it would have been very, very easy to, with a little bit of a hand wave, associate Germans with the bourgeoisie, because they're a very industrialized society. They're a very wealthy society. So, that would have been easy to do. We want power to pass out of their hands into the hands of of the proletariat and the poorest sections of the peasants.
Yeah. And that sort of question of the peasants, because you'll note there he says only the poorest of the peasants, that's going to be a huge thing in the history of the Soviet Union. Prosperous peasants had a very rough time. Yeah. We'll probably talk about that a bit. Either. We'll probably talk about that a bit in the next episode. But
thesis number 3, no support for the provisional government, a government of capitalists. That makes a lot of sense, considering he's in the competing entity. Literally like a member of that body. So he's not going to be a supporter of the Duma. And then thesis 4, this one's a really easy one to convince people of too, because legislatures are always very unpopular, especially when they're totally ineffectual, as is the case here. So that's a really easy one to get support behind. It doesn't have a lot of substance to it. At least I think the average person looking at this would have thought it didn't. Turned out that they were actually kind of willing to back that up later, but. You can see why they'd get support behind that one. Fourth thesis. The masses must be made to see that the Soviets of workers' deputies are the only possible form of revolutionary government, and that therefore our task is, as long as this government yields to the influence of the bourgeoisie, to present a patient, systematic, and persistent explanation of the errors of their tactics.
Yeah, so
the only real government are these Soviets. We've explained those before in our French Revolution series, but basically those are hierarchical government in which think of it as sort of a Russian nesting doll, right? Where
literally
the Soviets are right. The Soviets are organized from groups at the lowest level, usually local workers' councils, and they report up to one above them, above them, above them, and it goes all the way up to the Central Politburo. And that's the only legitimate government. But Lenin recognizes they're not a government yet. So currently what they need to do is write angry letters. And that is sort of the only valid and legitimate thing for them to do at this point, and that's how you know they're the real government.
Yeah, and I want to note, too, here, that clearly the plan is to undermine the Duma. So the only chance that they're really going to have at a sort of moderate liberal reform of their government in the form of something like a parliamentary system or, maybe some other kind of Republican system. From the beginning, the communists are saying, nope, we have to just poke at that so that no one trusts it and it can't stand up.
Right.
So,
and then this next one, here's where we start getting real radical. So we don't want a parliamentary republic. A return to a parliament would be retrograde, right? So we instead want to keep the Soviets of workers' deputies, agricultural laborers, peasants' deputies throughout the country from top to bottom. Not bottom to top, top to bottom.
Yep.
No, that's significant because...
No, you're right. You're right.
and that's going to... The only legitimate rule is going to be through this Soviet system, right, where things are divided along that Soviet hierarchical model we described, which is going to necessitate the abolition of the police, army, and bureaucracy.
Which, if you know anything about the subsequent history of the Soviet Union, there's some irony there because pretty much
they would argue they did that. No, they would argue they did that, David.
They would argue they did that, but what things really flourished in the Soviet Union other than police, especially secret police, the military, and
armies and bureaucrats, right?
Yeah.
The difference, David, is those were organized in terms of the Soviet structure now. So they weren't actually police, those were just the people.
Yep. Handy, that.
I mean, that's why they call it the People's Army.
Yeah.
And then it's, you have the Central Bureau of so on and so forth, which I guess is a bureaucracy because it's a bureau. But it's, it's not organized under the Tsar any longer. It's theoretically supposed to be composed of we the people with we the people's consent. But I mean, it's sort of we the people represented by the dictatorship of the proletariat. And who's the embodiment of that? Well, the same guy who's writing this.
Yep.
Which is convenient. Okay, thesis number 6. Nationalization of all lands in the country. The land to be disposed of by the local Soviets of agricultural laborers and peasants' deputies.
Yeah. And this one is the probably the most openly and sort of recognizably communist. Like, this is what we all sort of think of.
Well, the previous one as well, I'd say. But
well, fair enough. But in terms of like an economic program. Seizing and redistributing land. And we've talked before about how communism wasn't particularly popular. But you know what else wasn't particularly popular with the Russian people was large estate holders who had been feudal lords and just sort of kept that property. Nobody liked them.
What'll fix that is a single landowner,
the
largest of all, but we'll make sure that it's administered by local Soviet councils because that'll be fair.
Yep. Nothing has ever gone wrong with nationalizing land.
And then here's the next one, is sort of the Bernie Sanders program. The immediate, so it's, nobody likes banks, right? Banks are bad. Banks devalue our currency. Banks
they take our money,
tend to, because they issue money first, they tend to get all of the new value of the first money, and then everybody else gets that money only after its value's been depleted. A lot of things that aren't just about banks, unjust about banks, rather. What's the solution to this problem? Well, just ask Bernie Sanders. The immediate union of all banks in the country into a single national bank and the institution of control over it by a Soviet of workers' deputies.
Yeah,
that was the problem. Competition.
Yeah, when influential banks are a problem, clearly the solution is to make one bank that holds all the power.
One all-powerful bank. Yeah, this isn't an economy or an economics podcast.
No, but
I don't there's a lot that could be said about that. That is a deeply stupid idea. And that's not even a political comment. That's math, right? I mean, mathematically, this doesn't work.
Yeah. And it's worth noting a continuous problem for the Soviets throughout their history was that their own people didn't trust the value of their own currency. And so one of the main things that the KGB did was try to find people who were keeping foreign currencies and confiscate it from them and punish them for doing that.
Because apparently diffusion of banks was the problem. Anyway, thesis number 7. Oh, wait, that's one I just read.
Yeah.
8. Thesis number 8, to bring production and distribution of products at once under the control of the Soviet workers' deputies.
Yeah.
No more private factories. Mm-hmm. No more private production of any kind. This will also be administered by the same bureaus that are centrally organized, locally administered, as everything else.
Yep.
Why was this popular?
It wasn't really, except among people who were already communists.
That makes sense.
There's a reason why this was distributed in the communist newspaper and not in a different newspaper.
Yeah, but it's called Truth, so it's true.
Yeah, the way they really...
when they call their paper Truth, you
honestly,
don't get the fake news in this one.
Yeah. The way they really gained support was by agitating in the army at the front, saying, hey, the Bolsheviks, they're the ones who want peace. They're the ones who want to end this war. We should support them. That was, I think, really the sort of the key to all of this.
Well, and it really is. I mean, I'm kind of mean-spiritedly making the comparison to Bernie Sanders and his supporters, but it really is very, very similar to that. Much like his movement, he's addressing real problems people can't help but recognize. And then his solutions are just, insane. Like, I mean, I think that the appeal of the movement has nothing to do with the solutions to the problems. It has to do with the fact that they're the main group that's talking about the problems.
Yeah.
Because if you thought about the solutions for 2 seconds, you'd know that they weren't good ideas.
Yeah.
Except, they're good ideas for Lenin, but not really for other people.
And, so 9 and 10 are sort of more about communist party politics than anything else. But
so when was the last international held? What is the Communist International? What's Comintern?
The idea, which I think did we mention this last time? I know we talked about the fact that the Russian Revolution really had to reverse thinking about agricultural versus urban workers. But another thing that ends up being a problem for them is that traditionally Marxism held that the only way communism could come about was when workers of the world unite. So everyone sort of rising up at once, all of the workers in the advanced world have to come together.
Now, there had been previous attempts at sort of joining together in an international fraternity of workers and holding sort of a convention. Like, of it like International Comic Con in San Diego, but for it's Comic-Con instead of Comic Con. And, it's ostensibly international. Obviously, Karl Marx lived most of his professional life, at least, in London. So it kind of started as a London movement. And they'd held several of these before. I think the first was in 1864, if I'm not mistaken. And Lenin was saying, we got to have more Comic-Cons. We got to get everybody together so we can plan this international workers' revolution.
Yeah, because this was really critical to everything at this time. They thought Russia didn't have a chance on its own of establishing a communist order. But they also thought, hey, World War I is such a crisis for so many of the world's great economies and in powerful countries that we have a chance at kicking off just like a general sort of workers' revolt against the whole modern world. So they thought they could trigger uprisings in Germany and France, and I think they were always a little less confident about England. But,
they quickly revised that under Stalin once Lenin's gone. But Lenin was always international. He always wanted that international revolution, and to that end, he wanted another Comintern. So that's the first Comintern in 1919 ends up being referred to as the Third International because I don't know, they're counting 1864. I don't know which other one they're counting because there were several before that.
Yeah,
but for whatever ideological reasons, they only count a couple of them.
Right.
Because it's not really an international movement. It's kind of just people who agree with us. But
So anyway,
and lo and behold, Russia ends up hosting every single international after that. So.
And we're gonna sort of elide
like America. America always wins the World Series.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It's like the World Series of Communism, and it's basically Russia and then whatever
Cuba eventually. China's usually not invited.
The other little Soviet republics that they pretend are independent but are actually just
that's true.
extensions
That's
of
true.
Russia.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the sort of the real moment where the Bolsheviks come to power is what they call the October Revolution. So you had the February one already, and for a few months the Duma is kind of hanging on, mostly not. It's sort
Are we
of
getting to the
central
October Revolution today?
We're going to skip a lot of the history, but basically the thing I want to point out that's important is when the Duma finally does call for, basically a constitutional convention. So they hold elections across Russia for, people who are going to be sent as delegates to this constitutional convention. The Bolsheviks have been pushing for this forever. They only win like 20% of the vote. And so then they think, and they send armed men.
Maybe that parliament would have been so good for you after all, because with the parliament, 20% can actually gain control. But you didn't want that.
No, and it's probably not enough to actually implement a communist system. So instead of allowing this constitutional convention to happen, they send armed men in to basically disperse it at gunpoint. And
that's always an option, I suppose.
That's basically the October Revolution. We'll probably talk more about the nitty-gritty a little bit next time, but we're mostly going to be talking...
an idiot might say there's parallels to that in our contemporary history, too.
Well, perhaps. Anyway.
That would be very silly. We're not going to do that.
We'll get into the details and into the actual constitution that the Soviets end up bringing about next time around.
Next week, we're going to look at the Soviet Constitution. Remember, the late Justice Scalia, I'm going to quote him horribly out of context, make him look horrible, but this is the Constitution where he claimed they had a much better Bill of Rights than we do. But we'll look at that next week, see if that's true, see why that Bill of Rights seems not to have worked terribly well. We'll take a good look at some of the more egregious articles of that Constitution, one made very famous by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And if you want to check out a book on the Lex Rex reading list, we'll be adding Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago to our website so that you can purchase a copy of that with a small donation. And I think it's highly worth a read if you have several hundred hours.
Yeah, are we going to use the abridged version or the unabridged? I think that's the big question.
Unabridged,
okay,
for sure.
All right. Yeah, that's a time commitment, but I like Solzhenitsyn, his fiction as well. But
I think we ought to pair it with the Communist Manifesto, which is about that thick. You can read it in an afternoon. Show what that horrible book gave rise to. It's anyway. That's so for our February Revolution episode. That's about it. Do we have Kangaroo Court today, David?
We do. So if you want to...
Oh, well, come around, young and old, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, everybody who's interested, I guess, non-binary people, if you're listening, everybody who's interested in law throughout the ages and in all of its absurdity. Join us for Captain Kangaroo Court.
Yeah, and this is shaping up to be another long episode, so I'm gonna keep this relatively short and sweet. But this is going to be a little interactive. So I'm about to, sort of give some information on a few lawsuits, probably 3 or 4, somewhere in the neighborhood. But what I'd like you to do when I've described all of them is award one the sort of award of most creative, and one the most plausible.
Okay.
So those are the two things to keep in mind here.
You want me to do this at the end or after each one?
At the end. So we'll describe.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, go for it.
All right. So first up, we have a woman who I believe I read in a different article is an attorney, but she filed a $5 million class action suit in federal court against a repo company, and this came about because they repossessed, her 2008 Pontiac G6 while it still had half a tank's worth of gas.
That's a good car. That's a really good car.
I don't know if you heard that key phrase though. There was still half a tank of gas in it when they repoed it.
Ah, okay.
She says, her attorney says, it's the same as if you left your jacket in there and they didn't return it to you. You can't take someone's coat or fuzzy dice, and you have to return the gas.
Or at least compensate for it. I tend to agree with that.
She came up with this $5 million figure. And again, bear in mind, one you're going to award most creative, the other you're going to award most plausible. Or I guess it actually could be both. They could be both most plausible and most creative.
Okay, fair enough.
$5 million represents 3 times the fair market value of all the gas taken from Michigan residents by the Detroit-based automotive financial services company over the past
punitive damages, I assume.
Yeah.
Treble damages for some provision of Michigan law, probably.
Yeah. Additionally, they're asking for all of that gas to be returned or compensated at fair market value.
Yeah,
probably the compensation is more likely.
Yeah.
All right, so that's the first suit.
I think that's correct. You know, when they have a legal right to repossess your car, they have a right to possession of the vehicle. They don't have a lien on your gasoline.
Yep. Here, interestingly enough, the guy bringing the suit here was named Overton, which for those familiar.
So is it within the Overton window, or?
Well, I think not personally, but I'll get your opinion on it.
Okay. Well,
he sued the Anheuser-Busch
pretty wide
Company.
nowadays, so.
Yeah. He sued the Anheuser-Busch Company, which makes, Budweiser, among other things. Basically because their ads made it seem like if you drank Bud Light, pretty ladies would want to hang out with you. And they also didn't mention in their commercials that beer can be addictive and bad for your health.
Oh my gosh. Okay, now I got to clarify. Under ordinary common law rules of negligence, I think this guy would have no case at all. Mm-hmm. There may be some kind of ridiculous statutory modification saying that people that fail to warn about the addictive properties of alcohol are liable per se for something. That's the only way that I think liability could ever attach here.
Yeah, well, the courts...
The classic way of advertising stuff is to say that pretty girls will like you if you use it. I mean, that's how you advertise.
The court found...
Let's make a note of that. We'll do that in our marketing, David.
The court found in favor of Anheuser-Busch.
Which, by the way, she said yes over the weekend, so...
that's right, untrue. That's right, yeah. I already... talked to you since then, I forgot that we had mentioned that on the first part of this recording. But yes, congratulations to you and best wishes to her.
So if you advocate for the Constitution, I can say from experience, the pretty girls will like you. That's the conclusion.
Anyway,
maybe I'm going to get sued now. Who knows?
Could be. Overton, I believe, was seeking $10,000, so significantly less than that $5 million suit.
That's barely worth the legal fees.
But he did not win on that case.
Next
one up, a Portland, Oregon man tried to sue Michael Jordan and Phil Knight, the founder of Nike, for a combined $832 million. And the reason why is that he apparently bears enough of a resemblance to Michael Jordan that people kept asking him if he is Michael Jordan. And
that's Nike's fault?
He found this so irritating, yes, because he believed that the Air Jordan brand...
Nobody would have known who Michael Jordan was if not for the Air Jordan brand, right?
He alleged that the Air Jordan brand, which is a subsidiary thing of Nike...
It's not like they picked him to advertise for their shoe...
No.
Out of some kind of pre-existing fame. Nobody watches basketball, right? I mean, that's a name that is so famous, even I know it. The man was in Space Jam.
The Chicago Tribune perhaps unkindly notes that this guy, whose name is Alan Heckard, is 6 inches shorter than Michael Jordan. He does have a shaved head, and he does wear an earring in his left ear, which was a look that Michael Jordan was rocking for a while. He wanted more than $400 million from each of Michael Jordan and the founder of Nike.
What is he suing? Like appropriating his likeness? What's he suing for?
I believe that, yes, that was basically the idea. I think this was immediately dismissed. But,
there's failure to state a claim.
Yeah. I think that was the basic idea, that they were infringing on his likeness, despite the fact that it's just two people who look like each other.
He just happens to look a little bit similar to Michael Jordan.
Yep.
I love the idea that's like, because whenever you file a lawsuit, you want to make sure that you're suing everybody who's potentially liable for the wrongdoing, so that people don't just point fingers and say, it wasn't my fault, it was their fault, you should have sued them instead. I love the idea that it's somehow Nike's fault. You just got to be safe here. You got to sue them too.
Yeah.
And not the company, the guy that runs it.
Yeah. And actually, I'm not even sure he was still in charge of Nike at the time. I'm not sure if Phil Knight is still actively involved at all. But, who knows? He's the most famous name associated with Nike, I guess.
I don't know if I'd call that one creative so much as just incompetent.
All right. Well, our last one, my gut feeling is that this is the most creative one, but I'll leave that to you. A convicted kidnapper suing his hostages on the basis that he entered into an oral contract with them for them to keep him hidden from the police. And then when he fell asleep on their couch, they ran away and called the cops, and he ended up being injured in his arrest. So he
found a lawyer who would bring this?
Well, they sued him in civil court for emotional damages.
Oh, so he's countersuing.
So his countersuit, yes, was that he...
No, that's a little more plausible. Yeah.
But he came, he broke into their house. He was already wanted in connection with a murder case, is the way this goes. So he had fled, I think, from Colorado and gone to Kansas, running from the police. Yeah. He enters this couple's house, holds them at knife point, and he says, "You got to hide me from the cops. They're coming to get me." And
illegality is will void a contract.
Yeah. And he claims that he promised them money, an indeterminate amount of money, but some amount of money.
You need to be able to at least allege consideration, because if you don't, there's no contract. That's I'm sure. I can't imagine the complaint on it. It just goes through the elements of the contract, and it's like, well, here's an offer, here's when they accepted, here's the consideration.
What I think is interesting is that evidently what this couple did was gave him some snacks and watched a movie with him, Patch Adams, the Robin Williams movie where he's like a clown doctor.
Naturally, Patch Adams.
But then he probably, having been awake for a long time, fleeing from the police, he fell asleep on their couch, and then they just ran away and called the cops, which, I think logical move on their part. But
they could have been charged with accessory if they hadn't done that.
Yeah.
It's iffy on whether or not they'd be convicted, but
but
they're certainly comforting or aiding somebody in the commission of a crime, so or to help them get away with the crime at least.
Yeah. So his
that one's pretty creative. I'm going to give that one most creative.
Okay.
I don't think it's the most plausible, because
I agree,
even though they have alleged consideration, my bet is there wasn't any. They're just making that up. I don't think they have any evidence to support that. Verbal contracts tend to be very difficult to enforce because of parole evidence rule.
Not to mention, clearly under duress if you're being forced to enter into this contract at knife point.
Yeah, under duress. There's supervening illegality in this.
Yeah.
Any number of things that would void the contract. I'm just talking, I don't even think it's valid. You got to get to formation first. You have to see if a valid contract is formed. And then at that point, you can see if anything voids it. I don't even think a valid contract's formed here. So I think that one's not terribly plausible. But I will give it most creative. That's fair. And then the first one, I think that lady should win. The one that tried to get compensation for the unlawfully seized gasoline. I think that she should win that one.
All right. I feel kind of proud of myself, because those were both sort of my gut instinct winners as well. So we came in alignment on that.
All right. Well, there is some regularity and predictability in Captain Kangaroo Court, I guess. But that's all for this week's folks. That's all for this week, folks. Horribly misspoke there. Thanks for watching Captain Kangaroo Court. We hope that you all join us again next week for this weird, wacky, wonderful world of law in Wacky Land, or whatever. I don't know. Anyway, that's all. One brief announcement before we finish. I do want to say that our case challenging the Los Angeles County requirement that poll workers obtain vaccination for COVID-19 is now on appeal. We are appealing the decision in that case. So that is a huge matter that's in front of us. And, it may sound like a small issue. It's actually very significant, because if this is allowed to be upheld, what that says is that anything for which a county can claim there's some kind of valid health rationale, no matter how politically slanted, no matter how much it allows them to bias an election by putting their own people in place and prohibiting other people from participation in the electoral count or administration as a result of their politics. If this gets upheld, those sorts of activities will be upheld. So this is a very important case that we're fighting. If that's something you feel moved to contribute to, please visit us online at lexrex.org.
Yep. And I think that wraps it up for us, right?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Enjoy our packaged disclaimers, and we'll see you next time.
All right. See you next week, folks. Or 2 weeks from now. Or in
Sometime.
October.
Sometime.
Not in October. We'll be talking about October, though.
Yes.
All right. Take care.
Please note that nothing in this podcast constitutes legal advice, and all of the opinions expressed are the opinions of the individuals expressing them, not necessarily the opinions of the Lex Rex Institute.
The Lex Rex Institute is a nonprofit constitutional advocacy organization. If you'd like to learn a bit more about our organization's activities or make a donation, please visit our website, www.lexrex.org, LEXREX.org.
As a reminder, this podcast is a legal issues podcast, not a political issues podcast. We try to keep our commentary strictly to legal issues. Today, now that more issues are considered political than ever before, we believe it's especially important to distinguish between the two.
Thanks for listening to the Lex Rex Institute podcast, and we'll see you again next week.